Hello, and welcome back to ATA Live. I am your usual host, John Humphreys, and today I am joined by the second best economist in Australia, Gene Tunny from Adept Economics. Gene, how you doing?
Good, John. How are you, mate?
Yeah, top of the world. Another beautiful day in paradise here. So this ATA Live, I called this ATA, standing for Australian Taxpayers Alliance. They're the mob that puts food on my table. So if you like what we do, or if you hate us enough to try and want to force us to do it more often, please go along to taxpayers.org.au, check out what we're doing, consider becoming a member, and all that jazz. Check out the campaigns and get behind them as well. So we do this. We did this once or twice a week leading up to the election. I had a bit of fun releasing tax ideas, critiquing other tax ideas in the lead up to the federal election. Have taken a bit of a break after the election, but now we're back. We won't be doing it twice a week anymore. We're going to lean more heavily into doing the serious sort of economic tax related policy work, which is why I have coaxed my old sparring partner, Gene, to come back out of ATA retirement and join me in front of the screen. So we'll dive into a few issues. We'll try and keep these episodes short-ish, famous last words, but under an hour, I think, would be a good thing to aim for. This is, as always, being simulcast to YouTube, Facebook, and X, both on my accounts and where relevant on the Australian Taxpayers Alliance accounts. So whichever one you're watching it on, please give us a like and a share, and go around later when you have time and find us on all of the other accounts, and go and find Gene as well. We'll try in the future put up how you find Gene in on X and LinkedIn and wherever else Gene likes to cause trouble. So please, first like and share so we can start getting this out, and also chuck in your comments if you'd like to. We can see them live when they come in. If you have a question, a comment, a criticism, anything else starting with a K sound, you can send it through. And if it's good, or if it's funny, or even if it's terrible, we may put it up and then respond to you, and we can get into a bit of a discussion. So that's it by way of intro. The topic today that we're going to dive into is, there's been a lot to catch up on, quite frankly, in the last month. So I mean, we'll just let it go wherever. Neither Gene nor I have a script, so we don't know what each other's going to say. Half the time, we don't know what we're going to say. So the conversation will go where it goes. But the obvious thing that's come up recently is the national accounts are out. I know it sounds dry, but what it shows is the economy is going backwards again. Cue the almost cliche expected moment where Gene and I start saying productivity. But interestingly, the government said the same word recently. So they are saying they're going to do something on productivity, which I haven't looked too closely at. So maybe that's a good chance for me to throw to you, Gene. What? Feel free to say anything and ignore what I'm about to say here, but what has the government proposed?
Well, they've proposed a productivity roundtable. So essentially a talk fest where they're going to get industry, think tanks, unions all around the table at Parliament House. It'll be more targeted than the Job Summit, and it's going to address the critical productivity issues that are facing the nation, according to the PM. So this is the PM trying to, in a way, it's essentially just trying to cement his dominance. I mean, the PM obviously had a very good election campaign. I mean, he's come out of it very strong. I think that's addressed some of the concerns over his leadership. And I think this is another way that he can seize control of the economic agenda and show his place above Jim Chalmers. And so the media's been about how the Prime Minister has directed the Treasurer to have this roundtable. So essentially it'll be a roundtable. They can't touch industrial relations, though. I think that's one of the big deficiencies of it. So they want business to come to the roundtable, and they want the ideas from business, and they want business to agree with unions and think tanks, etc., about the right way to improve productivity. But yet the one thing that business probably wants above everything else, they're not going to allow. So I think it's going to be interesting. I'm not sure what it will actually achieve, but I mean, at least they're talking about the idea of productivity. Yeah, I mean, perhaps it is. I like that comment. Yeah, quite possibly. I mean, I think these talk vests can descend into that unless there's a really skilled operator running them. So the way I'm thinking about this is it's not what Hawke and Keating may have done in the 80s. I think there was a legitimate case for what they did with their National Economic Summit. I think Hawke was the sort of person who could get industry and unions in the same room and there'd be a bit of negotiation. And I mean, the unions wouldn't get everything they wanted. Business wouldn't get everything they wanted. They'd come to an agreement which was good for the country. I'm not sure that the current PM is going to be able to do that.
Like I don't want to be too negative before they've actually done it. So I'm bearing that in mind. But I mean, I got to say, I start this process with a lot of skepticism. I think people need to. Well, there's just not much real economic and policy work being done or policy thinking work being done. I think they still see productivity as a political problem. They're going to struggle to get reelected unless they do something that they call productivity. And I see little evidence that people want to actually make the tough decisions or they have the political courage to say something unpopular. And there are some popular things you could do to boost productivity, but a lot of it, to be done properly, will involve some unpopular decisions as well. And I'm not confident that there's much political courage out there. But having said that, I just kind of undermine my whole point. I don't want to be too negative until it happens, because we've got to live with some amount of hope. And eventually, if someone's going to do something right, it'll probably start looking like tepid steps. So, touch wood.
Okay. So if I want to be positive, if I want to say something nice about what they're doing, I think at least Andrew Leigh gets it or understands. Andrew Leigh, I think, has been saying some, he's embraced this abundance agenda that Ezra Klein in the US has advanced. And I mean, Ezra Klein, he's coming from it from a democratic perspective, but he sees that, like he's noticed in the US, for example, that it's easier to get solar farms or wind farms built in Republican-run states than Democratic-run states, because the Democratic-run states have more regulation, okay? And so Andrew Leigh is embracing this idea of abundance, that we're getting in our own way. There are all these regulations that are constraining economic development. So I guess I am a bit positive that, Andrew Leigh in the government at least gets it. But I mean, I think he's an assistant minister, isn't he? So whereas Chalmers is, he's the treasurer and elbows the PM, and they're more political rather than economic thinkers like Andrew Leigh is.
Yeah, they've got a pretty on paper good economics team. I mean, they've got 4 economics PhDs in the mix. Of course, Chalmers has a fake economics PhD, and I suspect he's the one that understands it the least. But sitting behind him in the junior roles that don't get any political say are 3 pretty impressive economists, I think, with PhDs from Harvard, Yale, and Oxford, respectively, which is, forgive me if I get any of the names muddled here, but Molino, Lee, and Charlton. Now, don't ask me which one went to which university. I know there's the 3 of them and the 3 fancy universities. But from little I've seen of what Molino's put out, it indicates that he's not crazy on productivity issues either. And I don't think Charlton's slow on the uptake. So they've got some good people in the background. Whether there'll be anyone with the political courage, once a good idea hits what's the strategists inside the political party say is coming from the opinion polls and the focus groups. Let's see how long a good idea can last. But I'm also not convinced. I mean, I've got an idea that isn't too far different to what Koro's saying here. Lower regulation, lower taxes. Then I would add ensure cheaper energy. And I know it sounds simplistic, but I think it is we can unpack this later in a little bit. I think that the focus, what too many people have when they look at productivity, is what is actually the best way to make this widget. And of course, we're not making widgets, whatever it is, a car, 2 liters of milk, whatever it is. What is the correct way? And then the government's job to increase productivity is to find the better way to do that thing. I would argue from the perspective of an institutional economist, you need to get the institutions right. What are the institutions that end up maximizing productivity growth? And I would say that's robust market competition. And the best way is to improve the incentives of robust market competition is to ensure, the main thing is make sure there's no regulation stopping you from doing it. And then tax is basically just another thing that impedes their ability to enter the market and decreases the number of people competing and weakens the incentives to get involved and stay involved. And then you'd also want cheaper energy because everything uses energy.
Yeah.
Everything being made involves energy. So anything that isn't addressing those three things, I think, is politics dressed up in the words of productivity to try and look like you're doing something. And I'm not confident. But anyway, we've got a little bit ahead of ourselves. Let me paint a bit of a picture first. I'll bring this up if I can work out how. The situation we're in. So this came out last week, the national accounts for those non-nerdy boffin types. This is just 4 times a year the government releases so the details on how the economy is trending. And you'd see the next day in the newspapers, people talking about GDP is this, GDP is that. And what you would have seen a lot of the media talking about is this line. The Australian economy rose 2%, 0.2%. Don't worry about the rest of it. Just 0.2 is the main thing you need to know. And this is real. This is already adjusted for inflation. So they're saying there's 0.2% more stuff in Australia. And that is true, but I generally am not interested in that line because I go straight down here. This is that line. This is the GDP line. That's the 0.2. And you can see the last couple of quarters, because he's done in quarters, which is 3 monthly increments, 0.1, 0.2. Yeah, that's nice. That's what they announced. The second line, I think, is infinitely more interesting because as we've said many times on this show, I think we've discussed it plenty of times before as well, Gene, what matters for your lifestyle is how much money there is per person, not just how much money there is in total. Like if you and I bought 2 pizzas and then we added a third person and added a third pizza, you could say, oh, look, there's a third pizza. What really, there's still 1 pizza per person. Right. I mean, so if you want to know about the prosperity or the well-being of the people in the country, it is this GDP per capita that is far more important. And as you'll see here, once again, it has gone into negative territory. Now, of course, for the last 2 years, we had 7 out of 8, 7 in a row negative quarters. And then it was only in every end of last year, we eked out a 0.1% increase. So the recession's over. The recession's over. Well, we've gone back into negative territory again. And so now something like 10 out of the last 12 quarters have been negative. For the last 3 years, pretty much, the Australian populace has been getting consistently poorer in most of those months. So it's not a pretty picture.
Yeah. So on average, I mean, when we measure it across the whole population. Now, I think part of it is a compositional effect, isn't it, John? So because we've got this large influx of foreign students who are coming over here to work as, Uber Eats delivery drivers or work and then we've also got the expansion of the NDIS as well. So that's, low productivity, or it's not a high productivity sector. So there are all of these compositional changes that are occurring in the economy. So I think in terms of diagnosing where we are, diagnosing the productivity problem, I think we have to recognize there are a couple of things. There's the huge surge in immigration we had post-COVID, and that's having economic implications. People talk about the capital shallowing. We've got all of these extra people, but we don't have the business investment surge to go along with it. So, the capital per head is actually declining. So now what that means is that, well, I think the way we're seeing it manifest in the economy is we've got all of these additional people, but they're working in relatively low skilled jobs. It's not as if we're putting them to work in advanced manufacturing or in high-tech jobs largely. So what we've got, I think, is this immigration shock that's contributing to the low productivity, and also with the expansion of the so-called non-market sector, NDIS in particular, where we've got a lot of labor-intensive jobs, which relatively low paid, not adding, as much value in the economy as other jobs might be. So I think that's they're some of the aspects of this low productivity growth that we're seeing.
Yes, I think there's truth in all that, although I think you're being more generous than I am. I also just think there's been atrocious policy settings that has
Oh,
decreased the
yes.
incentive to. But look, I think you touched on something there that I think is crucial to this, and it hardly ever gets touched on in the media when they're talking about the national
Yeah.
accounts. And I always look for it, and I looked for it again just before we came on here. But how much growth is there in private investment? Because too much the media looks at the GDP numbers and they think, well, how much is being spent now? And there'll be some amount spent on private investment, but it doesn't make up that big a chunk of GDP in total in that quarter. And so I don't think that's the reason why a lot of media isn't focusing on it. But what it is, it's the investment in future growth. It's like an
Yeah.
advanced indicator. Like you need to have that capital, a deep pool of high quality and a lot of capital if you want to have a prosperous economy. And the way you get that capital, the efficient capital anyway, is private investment. And so if you see weak private investment, even if you've got massive boom in consumer spending and government spending, and it looks like you have a strong economy, if you've got weak private investment, you are setting the stage for weak long-term growth. And we've had weak private investment now for a long time. We've also had, I'll go back to these stats because I pointed out this crucial, by the way, if you want to find this, just abs.gov.au, and then you click on the national accounts button. So this one, far more important, this GDP per capita number. I don't think it's the most important one here. You go down a little bit further, GDP per hour worked. Now, sometimes that's not as dramatic, but that basically literally is the productivity measure, right? So, but it's also what I think, what I'd argue is the thing that matters. Like GDP per capita could be increased just because we force everyone to work 14-hour days, 7 days a week. You take away public holidays, you ban leave, and you would technically increase GDP per capita. GDP would go up, population hasn't gone up. What's happened is you've forced people to work more. That isn't necessarily the purpose of life here. I mean, we're not just trying to make it so that everyone can make money and never have time to spend it. What you want is, and what we all learn very early on in economics, for the people who understand economics, you want to have the most output for the least amount of work. Right. So both sides matter here, both the output and how much work you had to do to get that output. So GDP per hour worked, which is basically the productivity measure. And you can see here, it's basically no change in the last couple of quarters and negative before that. And I haven't put it together for us for this live stream, but I often put it out normally once every 3 months, just the productivity graph in Australia going back a couple of decades. There's been no productivity growth in 8 years. Right, you saw a little productivity spike when COVID kicked everyone out of the workforce, and then you saw that sort of come back when they let everyone in the workforce. That wasn't a real productivity change; it was a composition effect, as you're referring to before in a different context. But that little blip notwithstanding, basically for 8 years, we have not been producing. Coming up to 9 years now, actually, have not been producing anything more with the amount of work we do. So that is also, by the way, that's the longest productivity slump since the ABS started keeping statistics. Right. So it's, I would argue that is the right metric. And instead of we have been worried about a 2-year recession, sure, as we should, but we're in an 8-year productivity recession, which I think is the more important metric and the more scary number. And this is why people like you and I have been waving the flag and banging the table saying productivity. But of course, as astute commentators, notices have said, it's easy to say the word productivity, and indeed the government just has said the word productivity. But what does that mean, right? Like nearly everyone can say, "Oh, I am for productivity. I am for kittens. I am against sort of clubbing baby seals." Right? It's very easy to say the motherhood statements. I'm for the good thing, but when you start to scratch the surface, it gets a bit more interesting. So let me ask you, Gene, what in the world of Gene Tunny, we have Emperor Gene Tunny has taken over the Australian Empire, and you don't have to deal with this meddling Senate. What do you do? What would a productivity reform agenda look like in the world of Gene Tunny?
Well, one, I'd probably go back to the IR policy settings we had. I mean, assuming we can't get work choices because that was just politically just unacceptable. I'd at least go back to where we were just before work choices. I mean, I think we're heading in the right direction with enterprise bargaining that the Keating government introduced. But since work choices was toxic, and then we ended up with Fair Work Act, and then progressively the government has imposed more regulation. They had their closing loopholes bill that passed a couple of years ago, and that's cracking down on the gig economy. It's cracking down on labour hire. I think we've got to go back to what we had before. I think there are a lot of potential productivity gains in industrial relations. That was one of the areas that in Treasury we were always, looking at or seeing as that was the area where we needed the reform process stopped. We got to, we did the trade reform. There was product market reform, national competition policy, and labour market reform was always seen as the next thing, but we never really quite got there. Or when Howard did it with work choices, it just proved so politically toxic. It just ended the prospects for that sort of reform. So I think, yes, definitely on the labour market side, we need to do something. And then, we've got to stop. It's all about, the regulation too. I think there is something to this abundance agenda that Ezra Klein's arguing about. There are a lot of regulations at the local government level that are getting in the way of progress. And someone in the chat, Coro mentioned building houses. So we are, getting in the road of a lot of development. I just go driving around Brisbane, you can see all the blocks that they've stopped development on. That block on the corner of Gibbon Terrace and Caxton Street at Paddington, right? The Workers Club building, they wanted to redevelop that into a mixed-use development, but it got stopped by the locals, and all these places on Gregory Terrace. So there are those type of things I'd want to see, get rid of those regulations. It would be good if we could cut taxes, reduce the size of government, really limit the growth of the welfare state. The NDIS is just growing. What is it? It was growing 20% per year on year at one time. I think now they're trying to get it back to 8%. It's still growing much faster than every other item of spending, and it's going to imply a higher tax burden over time. So Robert Carling is going to be putting out some, really great piece of research very soon. So Robert at CIS, that just shows if you look at the forward estimates of the budget and you look at our state governments, Commonwealth governments, the burden of government to GDP is getting up toward 40%, right? It's almost a record outside of a pandemic or wartime. And that is ultimately going to reduce productivity with the taxes that we need to pay for that. That's going to sap the incentive to work and to invest. So they're the things I'd be looking at, John. Yes, but I better let you jump in rather than me continuing to rant.
No, I think we got a lot of overlap in the core ideas. I'm going to quibble on one point. Work choices. What work choices was trying to achieve was the right thing to try to achieve, but they were doing it by superseding state IR laws. They centralized industrial relations in the hand of Canberra. And then when the Liberals lost power, which they inevitably were going to do, you can't write laws on the assumption that you never lose power. That's a bit ridiculous. Yeah. When Labor came in, they kept the centralized powers, which Howard handed them on a platter. And then now they centralized Labor's approach to IR. So, I think work choices was a mistake. I don't just say it's a mistake politically because it was unpopular. I think policy-wise, it was a mistake to centralize IR laws and take the power away from the states, because competitive federalism, sort of jurisdictional competition between state laws, I think, is a fundamentally good thing. Indeed, I think the only long-term institution that can counterbalance the natural growth of government is the competition between governments. And so I think it's a real shame when we centralize political power. So that quibble on work choices, notwithstanding that, so the IR regulation. And look, I think that's got a lot to do with the house prices. Now, I know the work coming out of CIS as well often looks at the zoning laws in terms of the zoning regulation, slowing down house prices. I'm not saying that's not a factor and you should fix zoning laws. I can't help but look at the cost of building, though. If the cost of building stays this high, how can we have cheaper houses, right? Because if you build a house, it costs you that much to build a house, you have to charge at least that amount to be able to pay your builders, right? So I think actually a lot of the building regulation also comes back to basically IR and building code regulation. So not so much land use. Fix land use because you should fix things, but the regulations relating to who's allowed to build, which is basically, labor market regulations in the building industry. Who's allowed to build? How can they build? What standards do you have to have? I mean, a lot of people, when they first, a lot of people listening to us, our age or above, when we bought our first house, we would have bought a house with lower standards than currently exist. And that made it cheaper and easier for us to buy our first house. And now the benevolent people in Brisbane and Sydney and Canberra have told us, don't worry, we've increased your standards. So now you've got great standards in that house you can't afford. That does kind of highlight one of the issues with regulation. It's easy to say cut regulation, and I will say it, and I mean it. The critics will say, yes, but tell us which regulations. Now, you've been very upfront, labor market regulation, absolutely. And another one is, I think, it's safety and standards. And it's hard to say that aloud because who's against safety? What sort of monster is against safety? What sort of monster is against high standards? Don't you want people to have better quality housing? Of course we do. But if you've made the quality so high that it costs so much to build it, that you can only get into the market with the cheapest house in a major city in Australia costing what, $800,000 to get not a lot these days, then I don't know if we're doing them a favor, making sure they've got that slightly higher standard. Let people choose their own standards by deciding what they pay for, would be my, of course, cliche libertarian answer to that.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, John. There's certainly an issue with social housing. They're finding that the cost of just delivering basic social housing because of the standard required, and all the other costs, infrastructure charges, etc., cost of land. I mean, it's up around $800,000 or something, right? Just for the basic social housing unit, or even more. We've become a real high cost country. The other issue, John, I think with housing, the cost of housing, it has to be the rate of population growth with immigration. I think both, and this isn't just this government. This is the previous governments as well. The policy settings that they've put in place led to that huge surge of people post-COVID that the economy and I think our society too really wasn't well placed to handle, to absorb. And I think that's had a lot of negative impacts on our economy. Certainly it's contributed to house price inflation. It's contributing to congestion. And it's also related to this low productivity we're seeing.
Well, the capital shallowing that you mentioned earlier, right?
Yep.
I mean, we don't have private capital investment to match the increase in the number of people. So the capital stock per person we've got in this country is declining. Yeah. On that housing thing, I mean, we're economists. I think enough economists are listening. We're allowed to use a bit of the jargon. I mean, we've got the increased demand for housing, and then the other crucial factor is, and I think some of the zoning conversation misses this a bit, the elasticity of supply of housing. That should be the crucial variable we're looking for, we're trying to understand, and we're trying to change. Where we would like a relatively elastic supply, so that firstly, we shouldn't be burdening the country with this much of an increase in demand. But if you did, then if you had quite an elastic supply, as demand went up, supply would go up. Now, talking about allowing the zoning to go through a bit more, this is like incremental step changes in supply. What I would like to see is reform that changes the slope of that supply curve, which I think probably a bit of a harder thing to achieve, but you're only going to start achieving it if you start actually focusing your direction towards that goal. And I think that is the crucial variable on housing. Firstly, decrease the amount of demand where you can, and change that elasticity of supply. And I also got to say, and this one goes a bit away from economics, but I think this is part of the story if we want to talk about house prices. If we live in a country, where the overwhelming majority of people all want to live half an hour drive from the same 4 CBDs, or 5 CBDs if you count Adelaide, but don't know if we count that as a real place. But if everyone wants to live even within an hour's drive of these same CBDs, there's only so far up you can build, right? Realistically. And before it turns into a very different beast. And that's always going to be at a premium. And as you bring in more people and they all want to live there, there is no way, I think, to have a sufficiently elastic supply curve if everyone keeps that set of preferences. So I don't know what can be done about this. I think the government is creating some degree of artificially higher demand to live in the city by having all of the public service jobs be in the city. Yeah, and that's the safety blanket of always live close to the city so you can get this public service job. Perhaps they could spread those public sector jobs around the country a bit better. And the infrastructure, the government invests a hell of a lot more on infrastructure in the cities. Then they care a lot more about a fast train inside a major city than they do about cheap petrol for people living in the rural areas, obviously, because petrol, carbon, the sun gods don't approve. But yeah, I think part of the puzzle, so going back before, the demand, which is the immigration question, the elasticity of supply, which I'd say that's the way we need to frame it, and the issue of can we somehow convince everyone that they don't all need to live next to the Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Perth CBDs? And I'm not sure how to achieve that one, but I think it's part of the story.
Yeah, no, I agree, John. I think we should be looking at more decentralization. Like, what if we set up a new state of North Queensland, for example, and we had Townsville as the capital, that sort of thing? Or
absolutely, yeah, I think that would actually go. No, absolutely. I think that would actually go a long way. I mean, that's actually what I have in my mind as a goal. I just didn't want to get too far ahead of myself. So I'm glad you said that. And I know I've raised that on a previous ATA live with Matt Canavan, and he jumped at that and wanted to talk about it as well. So there is some interest in the idea. So perhaps it's an idea whose time is coming. But that would be one way to guarantee the creation of new sort of CBDs that people want to live near, create new capitals because there are new states. North Queensland is a good one. Central Queensland could be another one. Northern New South Wales, South Coast New South Wales. There's Rexit in Riverina. The Riverina area wanted to do it. So I think it's a worthwhile idea because it also leads into the issue I was talking about before of competitive federalism, right? Jurisdictional competition, more states, more competition. So I'd like to see it twice over. Can I ask you one sort of challenging question for people on our sort of side of economics, politics perspective of the world? I think we'd both agree that one of the goals should be if I say more competitive, this is jargon, just lower tax, right? More competitive tax system, tax reform. I'll just be clear, lower taxes, especially lower income taxes. I don't just mean income on work, any sort of income.
Yeah.
So lower income taxes to incentivize more efficient behavior, more private investment, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think I need to convince you of that. I think you already agree with me that is an important goal. I think it's a centrally important part of a productivity agenda, both because it's hugely important, but also because it can be politically be done, right? You can go to the public and say, I will cut your tax, and you won't necessarily be immediately voted out of office for the crime of saying you'll cut someone's tax. So it's a double winner, political and policy-wise. And I think you would probably also, in a different context, agree with me that it doesn't make much sense for us to have deficits as high as they are right now. We're building up debt. We don't have the growth to be able to grow our way out of debt. We've got building up more and more state debt where the state governments have no revenue heads that can go faster than their spending growth. So they're just going to keep building up debt, and the federal government's eventually going to have to bail them out, whether they admit it or not. And so we seem to be on a trajectory, admittedly in Australia, a slow march, but nonetheless a march towards fiscal ruin. America's and Europe's going there much quicker. But a lot of people on our side of economics, politics, certainly myself included, I believe you have pointed to this problem and said, that we should be more responsible with debt and deficits by now. In the real world of politics, these two goals somewhat come into conflict, or at least the prioritization between them do. Right. So an easy thing to say there, or not an easy thing to say, but a logical thing is, all right, well, cut tax and cut spending by more, get your deficit under control, slowly pay down debt. I agree. If we're not going to be able to cut spending in the short term, which should be our priority? Getting the deficit under control or cutting taxes enough so that we can drive productivity? Because I think there are two conflicting goods there. And I think this trade-off, it'd be nice to say we don't have to make it because we can cut spending. But I think this trade-off is going to have to be faced. And my instinct, my suspicion is that the Liberal Party, if I can say, the people most likely to listen to many of our ideas, they still prioritize deficits over tax cuts. And I'm slowly coming to the conclusion that that's the wrong priority. But am I wrong? What do you think? How are we supposed to balance these two if we can't have the ideal world of getting spending under control so that we can have both?
Yeah, that's a good question, John. I hadn't actually thought of that question until you ask it. But I mean, why can't we think about both at the same time? Why can't we put forward a package that does have the tax cuts and has very significant reductions in spending over time? I mean, maybe you could make a case that, as much as I'd just trying to think, if it improved the budget in the long run, I mean, possibly you could tolerate some slippage on the goal of getting the debt under control for a few years. If you think that, okay, this will help stimulate the economy or contribute to productivity growth, as long as you've got a plan for bringing down spending. I mean, I think the problem we've got, a lot of these programs, it's like turning the Queen Mary around, isn't it? With the NDIS, that the policy changes need to put in place there, it's taking them a long time. One of the things they're trying to do is to develop these foundational supports. So one of the big issues with NDIS is that I think of boys of a certain age, what is it, 5 to 10 or so? I don't know the exact range or the exact stat, but it's something like 1 in 10 are on the NDIS for various,
It's
issues.
ridiculous. It's totally
well. I mean, it looks on its face, it's hard to understand, and the what the government is doing and working with experts and working with non-profits is to work on this thing called foundational supports. And the idea is that by having these foundational supports, if there are the right programs in place, then or the right interventions or the right education, the right support for families early on, that can prevent the children then going on to NDIS, which would be good if it works, okay? But that takes time to develop that policy. So look, maybe there is something to what you're saying. I'd like to think you could develop a policy that does a package that does both at the same time. I think that's really what we need. It'd have to be a very compelling case, John. I mean, and I know you've got you make the argument, or you've done the analysis that if you bring those marginal tax rates, you'll have this big increase in work effort. I think I've seen some of your work in that regard. Is that what you're driving at? You'll get that effect, that dynamic scoring, which will mean that the impact on the budget isn't as great. Is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah, well, one thing, the main behavioural response wouldn't be work effort. The elasticity of labour supplies is fairly small. The critics of tax cuts are correct to point that out. But our income tax applies to capital income as well. It applies to it's basically the tax you're going to pay if you start a new business, you do a new innovation, you take a new risk. So obviously, the more you tax that, the less private investment you're going to have, and a bunch of other issues as well. So, but yes, there will certainly be a growth in the size of the pie if you cut taxes, which is what I'm driving for. I'm not claiming that that would necessarily be big enough to increase revenue. I mean, I want to cut taxes enough to actually cut revenue. I'm not claiming that my tax cuts are just all the tax cuts I want would pay for themselves. I can think of some tax cuts that I think would pay for themselves, mind you, but left to my own devices, I would go much further. I would cut taxes in a way that would, and I would admit it, decrease revenue. So that's not my point. I guess I'm saying we would go to a government who's willing to listen to us with an agenda of here's some tax cuts, here's some spending cuts, and you can do them both at once and also get your budget under control. If they then said, look, I'm not doing those spending cuts, is our response to that, well, if you're not doing the spending cuts, you can't do the tax cuts. Which is, I think, the standard response from sort of careful people on the right, because they're saying, oh, well, I'd love to have tax cuts, but I can't yet because we haven't had our spending cuts. And look, we haven't had spending cuts for years, ever, basically. I mean, Reagan didn't cut spending, Thatcher didn't cut spending, Howard didn't cut spending. No one actually cut spending. So we're waiting for a unicorn to show up on a rainbow. And we say, well, when the unicorn shows up, we can have tax cuts. Or eventually, do we get to the point where, this stagnation, this productivity stagnation is so severe now. We need growth. And that maybe there's something to the political economy point that the people in government are going to spend every dime they can get their hands on and then some. So if you leave the taxes high, they will just spend it. But maybe if we cut tax, that will be the thing that might create the discipline on the spending side a secondary effect. Now, I'm not fully convinced of this argument myself, but I am starting to lean this way because it seems to me if we only ever cut tax once we get spending under control, we're just admitting that we're never going to cut tax. And I can't, the amount that we punish people for coming up with new ideas, for innovating, for investing, for taking risks in this country, the income taxes we have in this country, and you say, oh, income tax on workers, company tax on business. It's what matters is the investor, right? And the investor, when they invest in a company, pay company tax, and then the money comes out and they pay their income tax. The income tax is the tax that ultimately applies to a capital investment, or the income tax with a capital gains tax discount. But that's still tied to the income tax rates. And our income tax rates are bloody high, and they kick in very low. And without adjusting that, I'm not sure we can fix productivity. And without fixing productivity, I'm not sure how we get out of this situation. So I'm drifting to the, I guess, more radical position of saying we just cut tax. Even we give them spending cuts. We hand those ideas over to the government. But if they say no to the spending cuts, I think, and it goes against the sort of careful conservative approach to economics. I'm starting to lean to the idea of just cut the taxes anyway. Am I wrong? I should have warned you. I was going to ask you this. It's been on my mind for a while now.
Well, I think as long as it ultimately prompts an adjustment on the spending side, then I think that's fine. So this is the starve the beast hypothesis that you're advancing, I think, John, that the idea is you cut taxes and then because of all of the additional debt that you end up with, the spending cuts will be forced upon the government. I mean, possibly that could happen, but what we've seen in the US is that it just leads to bigger deficits. I mean, we had the 2017 tax cuts and we just blew out the deficit. There hasn't been any restraint on the spending side. So I think it's a risky strategy because ultimately you have to bring at least the primary budget balance back into balance. So I think it's a very risky strategy, unless you think that it is going to prompt them to make the adjustment.
I agree with you. There's no evidence to me that it's worked in America. America's a little bit different, and they get to just print inordinate amounts of money without experiencing the inflation that they deserve because they're the global reserve currency. But there's no evidence that works. I just think it's very risky to do the status quo as well. I think people are underestimating the sort of country shaking consequences from just creating a long-term stagnant economy. Maybe I'm overestimating the costs of that, or underestimating the ability of Chalmers to come up with just the perfect tweak to regulations that'll fix it without a tax.
Well, I think one of the risks is that they think the government has a hand in directing resources into the right sectors. I mean, maybe to some extent you could argue that, maybe we need some corrective taxation. So if there is this externality, if we are concerned about, CO2 emissions, maybe an emissions trading scheme or a carbon price would be better than what we've got at the moment with the mishmash of all of these subsidies. And this is what the Productivity Commission is going to be recommending, apparently, according to John Keogh's reporting and according to Danielle Wood's interview last night on 7:30 report. But the government wants to go beyond that type of thing. It's saying, well, we want to direct all of this money. We're going to have concessional loans. We'll have grants to favoured industries, to industries we think are going to drive productivity. So we've got this, tens of billions of dollars in their future made in Australia agenda. So they want to be able to, pick winners in a way. So it's got things like, the green hydrogen and green steel, et cetera. So there's all this money that government is making available to try to direct economic activity because they think that they know better than the market sector. Whereas I think a lot of economists would think, well, actually, it should be up to private investors to make the decision. They're the ones best placed to determine where the best investments are, really. And Adam Smith, all those years ago, 250 years ago, said that little else is needed to guarantee prosperity, but peace, easy taxes, and a tolerable administration of justice. I think that's
Easy taxes.
Very
easy taxes.
easy taxes. Exactly. Yeah. But yet the
No,
government, they want. Yeah. Go ahead.
I agree with your point that their instinct is to try and work out how to get the trains to run on time, as opposed to it's like a different level of analysis. They're trying to work out what to tweak in the engine to make it more productive, which, quite frankly, it's a logical question to ask if you approach the economy from like an engineer's perspective, right? Like it's not working right. What do we tweak? And it's the exact sort of question you've got from these group of very smart people in a central planning building. And it's what people assumed would work for most of the 20th century. I mean, it was just assumed that this central planning approach was going to be more efficient than this chaotic, random sort of everyone showing up and doing different things without a central coordinator system of the market. I'd like to think that the 20th century was enough evidence that the market works better, but it's like almost a degree of analysis. They're looking at what to tweak in the engine, whereas I think the correct level of analysis is, I don't know whether it's higher or low, but it's a different level. It's the institutions below. Which set of institutions lead to people to be more likely to make the decisions that lead to innovation and investment? Because those are the two crucial things that drive productivity. I guess we haven't really unpacked all the economics of productivity, is because there's only so much we can do in an hour. But I would say productivity comes from investment and innovation, the two I's. And the government's role is to set the institutions in such a way as to increase the incentives for people to innovate and invest. And I'm worried that they're not looking at this from an institutional perspective overly. I've got to say, by the way, just another thing that worries me, the announcement that the government would introduce a productivity agenda, and they said tax reform, because they always say tax reform. And the two things they said about tax reform in this article, if the journalist is accurately quoting Jim Chalmers was saying, well, look, we're trying to change the super tax. Everyone says they're for tax reform, but I'm trying to change the super tax, and people are blocking me. So maybe they don't believe in tax reform. And like my jaw hit the floor. It was like, so Jim Chalmers' vision of tax reform is to introduce a new tax. I mean, that's when I say we desperately need tax reform in Australia to drive productivity, I mean the opposite of that. I mean, we need to cut taxes. So that worries me, that their vision, and the standard thing coming out of like the Grattan Institute approach, we need tax reform because we have all of this runaway spending and we need to pay for it somehow. So we need more revenue. So we need to reform our tax system to raise revenue better, to pay for our runaway spending. I mean, they don't word it quite like that, but I think that's the long and the short of the consequences of what they're saying. And that means, anyone listening at home, Gene, you should try this. Google in sort of tax reform Australia and see how many pages you have to go through of Google before you find anyone with a tax cutting idea. You'll find a lot of really good tax changing ideas. Cut this income tax, increase GST, or cut this income tax, but take away these concessions, or whatever it is. A lot of ways to rearrange our tax system. Replace one tax with another. You'll find pages and pages and pages, and you'll also find mixed in there the Australia Institute coming out with a bunch of new taxes that they like. So you'll see new taxes and tax dances. It's a lot of pages you have to get through before you find someone saying, cut tax, we need to cut tax. And it's a little bit worrying.
So see the Australia Institute, there's Allegra Spender, tax reform. I can't find your stuff yet, John. I'm waiting for it. Anyway, I'll look at it later. But yeah, I think that's a good point.
Or any of it. I mean, it's tax reform shows up in a Google search, but it doesn't mean what I think you think it should mean. So that's a little bit worrying. But with the government saying that, so they're doing tax reform, they're introducing a new super tax. I mean, that lets us segue. I mean, we should wrap this up, I think, in the next 5 minutes. But the government is putting up a new super tax for our enjoyment. Gene, did you have a chance?
Yeah, I saw that. Well, I mean, they're cutting the concession, aren't they? That's what they would argue because they're concerned that the super. So just to steelman their argument, they're concerned that the super's being used as a tax effective savings vehicle for the wealthy. It's being done. There's more money going into it than they expected, or that is necessary for people to have a comfortable retirement. That would be the steelman version of their argument, wouldn't it? So I mean, I've been surprised just how much this has blown up as an issue. I mean, I think there's certainly design flaws with what they're proposing, with the lack of indexation. But I mean, I guess we do have a bigger problem with super, the policy settings around super, don't we? That we need to have that conversation nationally about, and talk about what the appropriate tax policy settings are. I think, like, if you look at what the AFRs say, like John Keogh's got an article out today. He's saying we need some reform of super. We need to start taxing earnings in retirement. So that's what he's recommending. I mean, maybe we need to chat about super in another episode, because I think there are a lot of tricky issues there, and I want to think about it a bit more. It's one of those issues I don't really have strong opinions on at the moment.
Yeah, you'll be surprised to hear that I have strong opinions on this and every other issue under the sun. Look, firstly, I think we shouldn't have compulsory super. That's my overarching thing, is that we just superannuation should be voluntary. I think there should be what people would call tax advantage savings, but I would argue that income tax double taxes savings, and so what I want is just take away the double tax. But that's maybe we're getting too esoteric. We need a whole session to dive into that. Maybe we get Cam Murray in here as well, because it's a topic he quite enjoys. But what they're doing here is you could say decrease the concession. That would be one way of thinking about it. I mean, it's not written into legislation as a concession. It's written into legislation that superannuation is taxed at 15%.
True.
And they're going to change that to, and it's true, most of us are on a tax rate higher than 15%, right? So, or on a marginal tax rate higher than 15%. So it is concessional in that sense. But it's written as its own tax type. And that 15% in some situations, they want to take it up to 30% is the new tax. And it's actually not an increase from 15 to 30. It's actually just a new tax, but it gets confused in how it's talked about. The tricky part, you're right that it's been talked about a lot lately. I did a podcast with Cam Murray, aforementioned. Fresh Economic Thinking is his website and his organization, if you guys are curious. We talked about this. We noticed that everyone's talking about the super changes after the election. Yeah, we just had an election. We just had an election between Liberal and Labor, and now the Liberals are very vexed about Labor's super policy, and they want to talk about it a lot after the election. So that was a little bit odd that it's become such a big issue right now. But the thing that's getting a lot of people up at night is the lack of indexation, as you say. The other one that's getting a lot of people vexed is this top up, this extra 15%. Will apply to unrealized gains. Yeah. So if your super fund has the top up 15% applies to the difference between your super balance at the end of year and super balance at the beginning of year, and that will be calculated with the returns that's realized, but also the returns that's unrealized, and a big super fund will be able to pay that quite easily because they'll have a very diversified portfolio with a lot of liquid assets. Self-managed super funds, depend what situation they're in. If you've got a big enough one that's diversified enough with lots of liquid assets, you could still pay that quite easily. But if you have a self-managed super fund that doesn't have a lot of liquid assets, and then one asset goes up quite a lot and you don't sell it, you're going to be liable for a tax that you have no way of paying without sort of doing a fire sale on your assets. So I think that's caught a lot of people's attention, that particular detail. But you're right to say that that's an issue of how they're introducing it. I for a while thought that they were playing the Trump game here. Where Trump puts out a big request that's big and silly and over the top, and then everyone says, "No, that's ridiculous. Can't you just ask for half that?" And then he comes back and says, "Yes, I'll take half that. Thank you very much." So I thought Labor was going to come back and say, "All right, we'll get rid of the tax on unrealized gains. We'll just have an extra 15% tax." And then by then, the Liberals would have to support it because Labor's adjusted in exactly the way they'd asked, and they'd be able to get a new tax in place with political support. So I thought that was their game. But for some reason, they're just stubbornly sticking to the tax on unrealized gains, which is, I find, a strange political tactic.
Yeah, I mean, I guess they think they can get it through, no problem. And I mean, it's part of they want to. I mean, I guess that's one of the things that makes having all that money in super unattractive. So this is part of the plan, isn't it? They want to get the money out of the tax effective super accounts and into another part of the, somewhere else, so they can tax it more. So that's part of their plan, really.
Yes, I did find it a little amusing at the beginning when you said to steelman their arguments, they would be saying that superannuation is just a tax-advantaged vehicle. Yes, that's what it was designed to be, and they made it compulsory to put our money in there. So,
for your retirement.
But we should do a whole session on super because, I mean, it is a complicated area that's not widely understood and quite messy. And I think probably I think a big mistake. I don't know where you sit on that. I know there's some very good free market sort of centre-right types who disagree with me vehemently on this, including the founder of the Australian Taxpayers Alliance, Tim Andrews, who disagrees with me on this issue. He thinks compulsory super is a good potential alternative to the state pension. But I think it is a failed experiment that is now causing more harm than good.
Yeah, well, I mean, as an employer, I didn't agree when this is going to sound privileged, but I didn't agree when they started jacking up the super rates. I mean, the super guarantee contribution rates. I mean, I think, what was it when it was initially brought in? It was 6% or something, and yet it keeps going. It's sort of
there was a 3% version for a while, but the 3% version I don't think was compulsory. It was just included in some awards under Hawke. But then 6 and then 9 and up to 12, and then they're aiming for 15. It's
It just keeps, they just keep jacking it up as if it's it's costless, or they don't recognize. I mean, it's costing employers. It was potentially costing employees, because it means that the employer can't they have to put this money away rather than pay it to the employee. And in many cases, I mean, some of these employees they'd be better off with the having the money today than sort of having it locked up. Yeah,
absolutely. And so I wrote a piece on this for Red Union, and I think some people from the Grattan Institute have got this right, and Cam Murray has also done some work on this. There's a bunch of stages in your life where it makes no sense to be saving that amount of money, right? Or no sense to be saving that amount of money for retirement at the same time that you're trying to pay off credit card debt. So you're being forced to save while you're in credit card debt. But anyway, that's it. Probably takes a full session. Maybe we should do that. We'll see if there's anything fun on next week, and if not, then we'll tee up a whole super session.
And get Cameron on. That'd be good. Yeah.
But we are coming up to the hour session, and I don't want these to go for too long because I don't want to scare people off from coming back or watching these on repeat later. So before we tee off, then, Jean, what's your sum up of should we be hopeful for Labor's productivity agenda, or what should they do that they're not going to, or what do we expect to see next? Anything you like to close us out?
Oh, well, they should have the bargain. We need to resurrect Bob Hawke and have Bob Hawke come and get the unions and employer groups cooperating and getting those productivity gains through changes in IR, and then having that grand bargain where there will be wage gains, but it won't be beyond productivity, and the unions will have to make some concessions that are in the interests of the country in terms of improving productivity. I think we need that sort of thing. I don't think we're going to see it. I think it's just all going to be, maybe we'll get rid of a few regulations. They'll identify some things that can be streamlined, some environmental regulations perhaps, that there'll be some trade or competition policy measures regarding maybe with supermarkets and land banking, etc. There'll be some things like that. But I think there's a risk that a lot of it will be where we need to direct economic activity in these areas of where we expect productivity growth, or where it's going to be consistent with us meeting net zero. And I think there's a real risk of this government direction and just picking winners and ultimately wasting a lot of money, and that's not good for productivity. So I'm not very hopeful at all, unfortunately, based on what I've seen.
No, I share your initial skepticism. I'm going to keep some amount of hope, because you never know, and you don't want to be too negative before I've seen it. But I'm not coming in with a huge amount of hope. My fear, I agree with everything that you're worried they might end up doing. My other concern is they might decide what we need to improve productivity is to centralize more power in Canberra. because from an engineer's perspective, this is a correct statement. I mean, this is the level of analysis thing I was talking about earlier. From an engineer's perspective, all of this sort of chaos and higgledy-piggledy different rules, if we just centralize it in Canberra instead of having these different states do different things, there's productivity gains to be made. And that is probably true in the short term. And it's very appealing, I think, to a Labor mindset. And I think it sells well to journalists who don't have too much time to do a deep dive into institutional economics before they write their article. So I worry that might be part of their plan as well, but we'll wait and see. We'll have an early indication, Gene, for whether they're serious about productivity, if you and I have our invitations in the mail or not.
Yeah, I'm not.
To join their productivity talk first.
I won't hold my breath waiting for that one, John.
We live in hope. We live in hope. With that said, Gene, thank you very much for coming in. Let's try and tee that thing up with Cam in the next week or two. I'll check with him his availability, but I think that's a worthwhile conversation for the three of us to have. Thank you at home for people who've been listening along to this, either live or on replay later. Please, like and share. Find us wherever we are on the YouTubes, the Facebook, and the X. My name is John Humphreys. This is Gene Tunny. This has been brought to you from the Australian Taxpayers Alliance. And thank you for listening, and I'll see you again next week.